Hi everyone, I'm Angela and welcome to Crafting with Angela. This is your new go-to place for all things paper crafting. Whether you've been crafting for a while now or are just starting out, you'll find a variety of tips, tutorials and inspiration here. Today I am going to be using the ink smooshing technique to create backgrounds for 3 cards. I will be using some Distress ink mini pads to create the backgrounds. You can see the colours on the screen and they're also listed in the description box below. We're starting off by using some white cardstock in a 8" by inch square piece. I have a piece of plastic packaging beside the card and I'm smooshing the ink pads onto it to get some ink on there. I'm starting off using lucky clover and peacock feathers, and then I'm going to be adding some water from a spray bottle. Then I will lift the plastic up and smoosh it down onto the card. As you lift the plastic up, the piece that is in contact for the longest will gather the ink and create a line in the ink. So you want to try and move it around to prevent that looking very obvious on it. I now need to leave this to dry before I add any other ink. Throughout this video, you'll see me wiping down the plastic and the desktop to remove any leftover ink to make sure things are tidy and we aren't accidentally creating a mess on the card bases. While that background dries, I'm going to move on to another background. This time I'm using picked raspberry, wilted violet and candied apple. I'm using the same technique and I'm swishing the ink onto a smaller piece of card. I noticed that I got some of my ink onto my work surface, so instead of wasting that, I'm going to take another piece of white card to wipe that ink up before smooshing the remaining ink onto the card. Then I'll clean my desk and use some tissue to mop up the excess liquid on the cards. You can leave it to dry with the liquid there, but it takes much longer and I find it easier just to take that excess liquid away. I've left these backgrounds for several hours to dry off completely before I come in to add the next layer of colour. If you don't let it dry, depending on the colours you use, you could create a muddy brown colour which wouldn't be very attractive looking. So now for the first background, I'm coming in with mustard seed, so a nice yellow colour, and smooshing it down. Then I'm moving on to the third background and adding some peacock feathers to it. I'm coming in with another scrap piece of card here. This is a card base that obviously I've cut down because it didn't work. And I'm going to add peacock feathers and wilted violet to it. Again, I'm going to blot off any large puddles of water and let it dry. I'm moving between the background pieces, giving them time to dry before I go in and add additional colours. So now I'm going back to the second background and adding some wilted violet. I'm adding more lucky clover to the first background, and again continuing to blot any excess water that's sitting on top of it. and letting them dry for several hours before we move on to the next stage. For all three cards, I'm going to be using embossing powder, so it's really important that the ink is fully dry, otherwise the embossing powder could stick to the ink. I've left these overnight, so I know they are dry, but you can always double check it by adding some embossing powder at the top and wiping it off if it sticks. The backgrounds are now completely dry, and I'm going to use 3 of them to create some cards. First, I will take the first background and I'm going to stamp a sentiment onto it. This is a stamp set I got off Amazon and I can't find the link to it, but I'm going to be taking the sending thanks from this set. I'm going to use my stamping platform to stamp it out, because with the way this is set up, I think it would be very easy to miss a part, especially with quite a big stamp for the thanks. I don't really want to mess up this background after I've spent so much time on it. Once I have the stamps in position in my tool, I'm going to use my homemade embossing buddy to make sure the embossing powder only sticks where I want it to. This homemade embossing buddy is a small square of fabric that I've added some corn flour into the middle of it and then tied a ribbon around it. I keep it in a plastic bag on my desk for whenever I need it. Then I'll add some Versamark embossing ink to the stamps and press them down. You want to make sure to press down uniformly when stamping, so I use this pressure tool to make sure I'm getting across all of the stamp. Next, I'm going to add the embossing powder. Whenever I'm adding embossing powder, I always put a piece of printer paper down to collect the excess, and that then also makes it easier to get that back into the jars afterwards. This embossing powder I'm using is from Wow. It's metallic gold rich pale superfine powder, but any metallic powder you have is good. For stamping sentiments, I always like to use a superfine or detailed powder, just to make sure you're getting as crisp an image as possible from the sentiments. Once the powder is on there, I tap it off, and I like tapping the back just to make sure any loose powder has come off. I'm going to come in with my heat tool. You want to make sure your heat tool's been on for a couple of seconds before you bring it to the card. You really want it to be up to temperature. Whenever you're heating embossing powder, you want to keep moving the heat around so you don't burn the cardstock. I always start heating from the back of the card, as I think that helps prevent the card bowing from the heat. When the powder is heated, you can see it turning shiny. And after you've heated it, give it a couple of seconds to cool down before you touch it to prevent any smudging. So that's the front panel for this card completed. I'm now going to stick it down onto a 6-inch square card base. Whenever I stick a large background piece onto a card base, I add double-sided tape around the edges and a small piece into the middle. I make sure I burnish it well with my bone folder. Then I'll use my pokey tool to peel an end of the backing tape up and fold it over at a right angle to create a tab. I'll do this for all the edge pieces and remove the backing piece fully from the centerpiece. This allows me to center the background on the base by holding the edges before I press it down. And this is the first card complete. For the second card, I'm going to be using exactly the same technique. First, I need to trim this background down, as this was an old scrap of card. It was a card base that I didn't like how it had turned out, and I cut the front off it. I'm just using the back of it here as scrap, but it's bigger than the card base I'm going to be using today. So I cut this down to 5.5 inches square, and that will give me a 1/4 inch border around the base, which is a 6-inch square base. This time I'm using stamps from the For the Love of Stamps Let's Celebrate set, and I'm choosing the Celebrate Your New Job stamps as the sentiment. I really like stamp sets like these, which give you a good range of sentiments for a really good price point. Instead of using my stamping platform, this time I'm going to use an acrylic block. I am, however, putting down a piece of fun foam just to make sure I get a good impression from the stamps. Because these are individual stamps, I'm taking my time to make sure that the stamps are all lined up, and there's a line on my work surface that I'm lining everything up on, because I feel a wonky stamp, especially on small stamps, can really ruin the look of a card. Again, I'm using my embossing buddy and Versamark ink. I'll press down on the acrylic block and give some time for the ink to transfer. I'm going to add the embossing powder onto this. This embossing powder is a detailed silver powder that I got from Love Crafts on eBay years ago. I don't know if you can still get this powder, but any detailed or superfine metallic powder will do. After I added the powder, I felt the sentiment needed something else to help it stand out. In the stamp set there are small stars and lines, and I decided to add the lines around the sentiment to suggest that it was shining. Originally I was only going to add the lines to 2 of the corners, which is why I stamped those first of all. But then I decided to actually go around the whole sentiment together, and I like how it looked, the finished sentiment. Again, I'm going to stick this background onto a 6 by 6 inch card base using double-sided tape. For the final card, I'm going to cut a 2.5 inch by 7 inch strip from the first background. That was the large background. The card base that I will be using here is a 5 inch by 7 inch of standard card base and has dots embossed into it. I'm also going to take a small scrap of that background and stamp my sentiment onto it. I'm going for a get well soon sentiment. This is a stamp that I've had in my stash for years and I can't remember where I got it from. The last time I used this stamp, I previously cut it down so that it could be stacked on top of each other, because that's what I needed for that card at the time. But this time I want the stamp to be in a line. So I've lined it up again and I'm just pressing an acrylic block onto it. Don't be afraid to cut up your stamps like that. If you do want to cut them, the only thing I would say is use a very small pair of scissors and make sure you have enough room to cut between the words. I'm using Versamark again, and I've stamped the words on one end of the small strip. Again, this is another old embossing powder that I'm using. It's from Personal Impressions and it's the colour Kettle Copper. But I like it because I think it matches the font of the sentiment. Once I've heated the powder, I cut the strip down around the sentiment. And I'll add the background strip to the centre of the card base with double-sided tape. And then I'm going to add some pre-cut foam tape. It's 2mm foam tape that I will add to the back of the sentiment just to give it some dimension. And that's the third card finished. So let's have a look at all 3 cards in more detail.